You are fluent in a language most people do not speak, and the loneliness of that is not something you can explain to the people who do not speak it, because the explanation itself requires the language. There is a kind of loneliness that has no name, not the loneliness of being alone in a room, not the loneliness of a failed relationship or a lost friendship or a crowd that does not see you. Those kinds of loneliness are painful, but they are legible. The world has words for them. The world has remedies. The loneliness I am talking about is different. It is structural. It lives below the surface of every conversation you have ever had, every connection you have ever made, every room you have ever entered. It is not the absence of people. It is the presence of depth that most of the people around you cannot match, do not feel, and in many cases cannot even perceive. This is what I want to talk about today, not as a diagnosis, not as a consolation, but as an act of naming, because Jung believed, and I believe, that what is named can be engaged with consciously, and what remains unnamed operates on us from the dark. The wound that looks like preference. The first thing that needs to be said is this. The loneliness of depth is not introversion. It is not shyness. It is not social anxiety dressed up in philosophical language. Many deeply intuitive people have spent years telling themselves, or being told, that what they experience is simply a preference for solitude, that they are selective about their connections, that they recharge alone. All of this may be true, but it is not the whole truth. The whole truth is harder and more precise. You do not merely prefer depth, you require it. The way a lung requires air, not as a luxury, but as a biological minimum. And when you spend extended time in relationships, conversations, environments that cannot offer it, something in you does not merely feel tired. Something in you begins to suffocate. Jung understood something essential here. In his model of psychological types, he described introversion not as social withdrawal, but as a direction of psychic energy, libido flowing inward toward the subjective factor rather than outward toward the object. He was adamant that introversion had nothing to do with shyness or social incapacity. The introvert does not flee connection. They flee the wrong kind of connection, the kind that asks you to perform the surface of yourself indefinitely, that rewards the mask and punishes the face beneath it, that calls depth intensity and intensity too much. Most deep, intuitive persons have been told they are too much. At some point, most of you learned to make yourselves smaller, to modulate, to translate your inner world into something the room could tolerate. And you became very good at it. So good that sometimes even the people closest to you do not know what is actually happening inside you. That is not introversion. That is a wound that learned to function. The specific texture of this loneliness. Let me try to describe it more precisely, because precision is what this conversation owes you. It is not that you cannot connect with people. You can. You are often extraordinarily good at it. You can meet people where they are. You can be warm, engaging, present. You can make someone feel seen in a single conversation in a way they have never felt seen before. But there is a level below that where you live, a level where the questions you actually carry, the perceptions you actually have, the inner life you are actually navigating, almost no one ever reaches. Not because they do not care, but because they do not know it exists. And you stopped pointing to it a long time ago, because pointing to it and watching someone's eyes go blank is a particular kind of pain that teaches you quickly to stop. So you learn to live in two registers simultaneously. The surface register, competent, functional, often genuinely warm, and the deep register, where the actual work of your inner life happens, mostly alone. You become bilingual in the most exhausting sense, fluent in the ordinary language the world speaks, and fluent in a language that has almost no native speakers in your immediate vicinity. This is what creates the loneliness, not the absence of connection, the presence of a translation gap that never fully closes. And here is the part that is rarely said. The translation gap does not only exist between you and others, it often exists between you and yourself, because living so long in the surface register, performing comprehensibility, making yourself legible to those around you, can create a kind of internal estrangement. You can lose contact with your own depth. You can find yourself in that quiet place where the deep register should be and discover that you have forgotten how to access it, that the loneliness has turned inward. Jung had a concept for something like this, what he called, borrowing from anthropological tradition, loss of soul. He used this term to describe a state of psychic collapse, a condition in which a vital part of the personality splits off from consciousness, and takes on an autonomous life of its own. In his words, it amounts to the emancipation of a complex that becomes a tyrannical usurper of consciousness. It is what the French psychiatrist Janet called abaissement du niveau mental, a lowering of the threshold of consciousness, experienced as listlessness, emptiness, a loss of one's own animating center. It is not simply sadness. It is the feeling of being estranged from the part of yourself that makes you feel real. When you have spent years translating yourself for others, compressing your inner world into something the room can digest, what you risk is not just exhaustion. You risk exactly this: a slow, quiet exile from the living core of your own psyche. What Jung actually understood. Jung wrote extensively about what he called the suffering of type, the neurosis that arises not from pathology, but from the mismatch between a person's natural typological orientation and the demands of the world around them. In psychological types, he argued that when the dominant attitude is chronically suppressed or forced into the wrong mode of adaptation, the energy required to maintain that mismatch eventually exceeds what the psyche can sustain. The result is not a defect of personality. It is the psyche protesting its own distortion. He was also one of the first to articulate, through his model of the four functions, that intuition is not a quantity of intelligence or sensitivity that can be turned up or down. It is a perceiving function, a fundamental way of apprehending reality that grasps patterns, possibilities, and meanings beneath the surface of things. The deep intuitive person does not experience the world and then decide to go deeper. They experience the world already oriented toward what is hidden, implied, or not yet manifest. The depth is not something they add. It is the water they swim in. This means the loneliness is not optional. It is not a choice or a tendency that could be corrected with better social skills or a more optimistic attitude. It is the structural consequence of perceiving reality through a function that most people do not lead with, and that the dominant culture does not reward. And here is where Jung becomes genuinely useful, rather than merely descriptive. He did not believe this was a defect. He believed it carried a responsibility, the responsibility to become conscious of what you carry, to work with it rather than against it, to find the rare others who perceive at the same register and build something with them, and to make the depth productive rather than merely painful. The loneliness in this framework is not the problem. It is the invitation. It is the pressure that, if not avoided or anesthetized, eventually forces the question, what is this depth actually for? The ways we avoid the question. Because the question is hard, most deep intuitive people develop strategies to avoid it, not consciously. The psyche is subtle about this. Some of you fill the loneliness with busyness, not the ordinary busyness of distraction, but the sophisticated busyness of people who are too intelligent for simple distraction. You fill it with projects, with learning, with the endless consumption of ideas and frameworks and perspectives that give the depth something to do without requiring you to actually inhabit it. Some of you fill it with the wrong relationships, not out of stupidity but out of hunger. You choose people who need you, who admire you, who are fascinated by your depth from a safe distance, who can almost meet you but not quite. The not quite becomes familiar. The translation gap becomes the baseline, and you mistake the warmth of being needed for the nourishment of being known. Some of you fill it with the inner world itself, retreating so completely into the interior landscape that the loneliness is no longer felt because contact with the outer world has been reduced to a minimum. This is the most seductive strategy because it feels like depth when it is actually its own form of avoidance. True depth, in Jung's understanding, is not a retreat from the world. It is a more profound engagement with it. Introversion that loses all connection to the object tips into neurosis just as surely as extroversion that loses all connection to the subject. And some of you, and this is perhaps the most sophisticated avoidance of all, fill the loneliness with the analysis of the loneliness. You understand your situation with extraordinary precision. You can describe the translation gap, the double register, the structural isolation, with a clarity that would impress any psychologist. And the understanding becomes a substitute for the thing itself, the map again mistaken for the territory. What it actually costs, the unexamined cost of this loneliness is enormous, and it operates mostly below the threshold of conscious awareness. It costs energy, the constant energy of translation, of modulation, of making yourself comprehensible and tolerable to a world that is not built for your register. This is why deeply intuitive people so often feel exhausted by social interactions that others find effortless. It is not the interaction that drains you, it is the translation. It costs authenticity. Not dramatically, not all at once, but incrementally. Each time you modulate downward, each time you leave the deepest thing unsaid, each time you watch the eyes go blank and decide not to try again, a small amount of the authentic self is quietly retired. Over years, this accumulates into a significant estrangement from your own interiority. It costs relationships, because the relationships that are available at the surface level, however warm and genuine, cannot carry the weight of a soul that needs to be fully known. And so the hunger persists even inside connection. And the hunger, unfed, eventually creates distance even where love exists. And it costs the productive use of the depth itself, because depth that has no outlet, no interlocutor, no creative or relational container, turns on itself. It becomes rumination. It becomes the over-analysis of everything and the resolution of nothing. It becomes the depth feeding on itself for lack of anything else to feed on. The thing that actually helps. I want to be honest here because I think a lot of writing about this topic offers comfort without substance. The loneliness of depth does not go away. I do not believe it is meant to. It is part of the structure of who you are, and removing it would require removing the depth itself, which would be the greater loss. But it can be transformed, and the transformation happens in a specific way that Jung pointed to throughout his life, through encounter. Not just any encounter, the encounter with someone or something that meets you at the level where you actually live. This can be a person, the rare person who speaks the language, who does not need you to translate, who goes quiet in the same places you go quiet, and who understands exactly why. These people exist. Finding them is one of the primary tasks of the deeply intuitive life, and it requires a willingness to keep showing yourself fully even after the eyes have gone blank many times before. It can be a tradition, philosophical, spiritual, artistic, that was built by people who lived at the same register. This is why deeply intuitive people so often find their deepest companionship in books, in music, in the work of people long dead, who somehow manage to say the exact thing. This is not a consolation prize. This is a legitimate form of encounter. Jung himself found essential interlocutors in Goethe, whose Faust he returned to throughout his entire life as a symbolic map of the psyche, and in the alchemists, whose strange symbolic language he recognized as an unconscious articulation of the individuation process. The encounter does not require contemporaneity. It can be the creative work itself, the act of making something that externalizes the inner world and gives it a form others can enter. This is why so many deeply intuitive people are drawn to writing, to music, to any form that can carry depth. The creative act is not merely expression. It is the construction of a container large enough to hold what you carry, and to invite others who carry the same thing to recognize themselves in it. And it can be the solitude itself, but solitude inhabited rather than merely endured. The difference between solitude as isolation and solitude as inner encounter is the difference between an empty room and a room where the most important conversation of your life is happening. Jung's method of active imagination, the deliberate conscious engagement with the images and figures that arise from the unconscious, treating them as real interlocutors rather than mere fantasies, is one of the most powerful tools ever developed for transforming the loneliness of depth into something productive, not comfortable, productive. The name changes something. I started by saying that there is a kind of loneliness that has no name. I want to end by saying that the naming matters more than it might seem. When something has no name, it operates in the dark. It creates the feeling that what you experience is abnormal, excessive, a sign of something wrong with you. Many deeply intuitive people have spent years, sometimes decades, interpreting their loneliness as a personal failure, a failure of sociability, of adaptability, of the basic human capacity to connect. The naming reveals it for what it is, not a failure, but a condition. The condition of carrying more depth than most of your environments have been built to hold. The condition of perceiving reality through a function that most people do not lead with. The condition of being, in the deepest sense, a minority, not of identity, but of interiority. And minority conditions, when named and understood, stop being sources of shame and start being sources of something more interesting: solidarity, the recognition that others carry the same thing, that the language exists even if the speakers are rare, that the translation gap, while real and permanent, is not the whole story. The container was too small. It was never that you were too much. And the work, the real work, the Jungian work, is not to make yourself smaller. It is to find and build containers worthy of what you carry. That is what this channel is for. That is what this podcast is for. And if you are listening to this, you already know that the language exists. You have always known. This work is listener-supported. If you found value here, you can support it on Ko-fi or explore the store. Links are in the description. And for more explorations of depth psychology for deep intuitives, you can subscribe to my Substack, The Hidden Chamber. You'll find the link below. Thanks for listening.